Welcome to this new chapter, Chapter 6, Multi-Factor Model. In the previous lecture, you have learned the Markowitz portfolio theory, capital assets pricing model, CAPM, but both of them have some problem. So in this chapter, we will introduce the new theory, the arbitrage pricing theory. Because capital assets pricing model only consider a single factor, so we introduce the arbitrage pricing theory to consider multi-factors. So this chapter we will begin with the arbitrage pricing theory. So we will introduce some conceptual basis and assumption for APT model. And then we will compare the APT with capital assets pricing model, CAPM. And last, we will introduce the arbitrage opportunity. The next part, we will introduce the multi-factor model. The multi-factor model considers several multi-factors in the model. And the last one, we will introduce the application of multi-factor model. So let's begin to have a look at the 6.1, the APT model. So as I mentioned before, the CAPM model has criticized because there are too many unrealistic assumptions, such as no transaction cost, no tax. And the second problem for capital assets pricing model is only consider additional risk variable, and CAPM only consider a single factor risk. So we should include more additional risk variables to analyze the stock return or need for different risk exposure. So both of the theory and empirical study find that additional risk factors should be included in the model. The CAPM cannot explain why the small capitalization stock is much better than the big capitalization, and why the value stock performs better than the growth stock. So we should consider the multi-factors. And the third point, it is criticized because it is difficult in selecting a proxy for the market portfolio as a benchmark. So if you are using the CAPM model, you definitely need to select a market portfolio. This market portfolio means that this portfolio includes all the risky assets. But in reality, we cannot find a best portfolio can be the proxy of this market portfolio as the benchmark. So if you use Standard & Poor's 500, or you can use Shanghai Stock Composite Index, SSE Composite Index, it could not be a good market portfolio for the bond portfolio. So that's the problem for the CAPM model. So based on this criticization for the CAPM, we will go to a new theory. So in the empirical study, we introduced the arbitrage pricing theory. So arbitrage pricing theory, we can also call it APT model. It is an alternative pricing theory with fewer assumptions was developed. So compare with CAPM model, APT model has fewer assumptions. So we'll discuss the assumptions later. And the second, this APT model developed by Stephen Rose in 1976. And it's also a linear model. So both APT model and CAPM, they are the linear model. But APT is with multiple systematic risk factor priced by the market. But it's not argued that the market risk should be included in your model. Now let's have a look at the assumptions for APT. And the first assumption for APT is capital markets are perfectly competitive. So which means there is no transaction cost or the test. And all the investors, they are price taker. So that's the first assumption. The second one, investors always prefer more wealth to less wealth with certainty. So they prefer more wealth. And the third one is the stochastic process. Generating assets return can be expressed as a linear function of a set of key factors. And the last one is all unsystematic risk is diversified away. So that's the same one as the CAPM model. So no unsystematic risk included in your model. But compare with the assumption for CAPM, CAPM require that the investor process should be your utility function. And also the CAPM require that all the return, the stock return should be follow the normal distribution. And the last one, for CAPM, we require that we need to follow the mean variance theory to find the efficient portfolio. And then we need to, based on the investor's risk aversion, to decide which is the optimal portfolio. So you can think about on your capital assets pricing model, we have your efficient frontier, and we find the CML, so we find the optimal portfolio, and then we use the efficient frontier to decide which is your investor's optimal portfolio. Okay, now let's have a look at the APT model. This is the formula for APT theory. So we can have a look at on the left-hand side of the equation. It is your expected return for the individual assets or portfolio. And it should equal to the lambda 0 plus lambda 1 multiplied BI1, etc. And this lambda 0 is our expected return on assets with zero systematic risk. In other words, it can be replaced by RF, your risk-free assets. And this lambda 1, lambda 2, and 2 lambda k, which is the risk premium related to the G's common risk factor. We can also call this the factor risk premium or the factor price. And the next one is our B1, B2. This BIG means that the pricing relationship between the risk premium and the assets, and how representative SSI is to the G's common factor. So generally, we call this the sensitivity, factor sensitivity. So this is the APT model, so remember that. And then let's compare the difference between CAPM and APT. As we know, as I mentioned before, both of APT and CAPM, they are linear model. So the form of equation are linear equation. And the second, the number of risk factor in both of these two models, the CAPM is only one risk factor, which is our market risk. And the APT model, we have K's risk factor. So K different risk factor like lambda 1 and 2 lambda K. So it should be greater than equal to 0, greater or equal to 0. And that's the big difference between CAPM and APT. So CAPM only consider a single factor, but APT consider the multi-factor. And the third problem is the factor risk premium. In CAPM, the factor risk premium is ERM minus RF. That's our market risk premium. And for the APT model, we have the lambda. So lambda is our each factor's risk premium. So we use lambda G to denominate that. And the next difference is the risk factor sensitivity. For CAPM, we have only one risk factor, that's the market risk. So the risk sensitivity, we denote it is beta 1. Beta, you learn in CAPM chapter, it is measure the systematic risk. And in APT model, we use BIG to denote that the risk sensitivities. So we have BI1, BI2, or BIK. The last difference between these two models is CAPM that define the market portfolio return as the factor. APT model does not identify the specific risk factor or number of factors. So APT does not require that one of the risk factor is the market portfolio. So for CAPM, we only have the market risk. But for APT, we don't need to include the market risk. And also in APT, we did not identify the specific risk factor and the number of factors.